Hi, everyone, and welcome back to The Global Gaze, where we talk art, film, and books from an international perspective. I'm your host, SarahJilani. I'm an academic, a freelance arts writer, and a lifelong third culture kid. In recent years, there's been a growing push for museums to return artifacts. In 2002, directors from over 18 museums, including the Louvre in Paris, France, and the Berlin State Museums, issued a statement. This public statement defended what they called the Universal Museum. They claimed, essentially, that despite a few hiccups along the way, museums had overall been agents of global culture, safekeeping, and heritage. So the idea in that statement was that European and North American museums and arts institutions were somehow uniquely positioned to be the caretakers of the world's culture and heritage. We're going to unpack this notion in this video because it's an idea that has its own history. It isn't actually an objective or obvious notion. It assumes that cultural stewardship is somehow inherently more safe in the global north, that by extension, the countries of the global south, which is the majority of the world, somehow either lack the political stability, the economic resources, the knowledge, or generally the ability to safeguard their own cultural heritage. The thing is, there has been a lot of progress in this area since 2002. That's 2 decades ago. There has been a lot of new museums built and many different approaches taken in order to erase some of these logistical aspects of the problem. And yet, we still aren't seeing any meaningful mass repatriation of objects southward. That's because this isn't just a logistical or practical claim, this idea that somehow the global south isn't equipped to take care of their own cultural objects. It's actually a political narrative that's been around a lot longer than we may think. This narrative is one that echoes older beliefs left over from the colonial era. An idea that says only some are fit to manage the cultural value of others. So what are some of the ways in which this narrative is still kind of baked into discussions of museum practice and repatriation today? Well, for one, it's deeply tied to the myth of objectivity. Museums often present themselves as spaces that are above ideology, that they are not political, neutral. Now, if one claims that neutrality and objectivity have a certain geography, right? They belong to some people in some places, and they are out of the reach, for some reason, of certain others, then we get an ideological narrative. If institutions in Europe and North America propose that they are uniquely equipped to safeguard cultural objects because of their so-called neutrality or objectivity, this is already saying something about those locations in the world that are not the West as somehow being inherently emotion-driven, unstable, or politically motivated spaces. If we start from that point, then the whole repatriation debate is reframed as a kind of clash. A clash between reason and feeling, between order and chaos, when in fact, it's evidently about power and who gets to understand and interpret global history. In her book, Decolonize Museums, Shimrit calls universality a weapon. Having delved into the legal battles that are ongoing with regards to repatriation, Lee has found that this idea is often used in order to block progress. What it does is it hides a very political assertion, which one may or may not believe, and that assertion being that it is Europe and North American institutions that have the foresight, objectivity, and attitude to protect global cultural heritage, and it turns it into a given, something neutral, something that is assumed to be common sense. That's the way in which the notion of universality or objectivity in these discussions becomes a weapon. It's kind of like saying every other decision taken by everybody else is motivated by some ulterior political idea, but somehow uniquely mine stem from pure reasoning. And yet, museums and institutions of heritage in the global north position themselves as objective and universal as a given. But to believe that museums are somehow above all this political stuff, that they're simply neutral spaces of learning, ignores how deeply they're rooted in histories of conquest, empire, and slavery. So let's first start with some of the legal ways in which museums say they can't return objects. The 1963 British Museum Act explicitly forbids trustees from deaccessioning objects in the UK. But let's pause and remind ourselves of that date, 1963 Act. This law was passed in the midst of African decolonization, the wave of independences in the 1960s and onwards across the African continent that saw independent nation states and governments come into being. For former colonial powers in Africa, like Britain and France, it was clear that there was the risk of these new independent governments starting to ask for their loot to be returned. So when museum directors claim their hands are tied by the law, it's worth asking, tied by whom and to whose benefit? Today, institutions that hold a lot of materials that were taken during the colonial era, like the Victoria and Albert Museum and the British Museum, both in London, are shielded by laws and exemptions like this. These laws didn't fall out of the sky, nor were they neutral. They were written by British government officials to secure colonial spoils when independence movements began to gain traction. But even when objects are returned, it doesn't always mark the end of an unequal situation. A great example that delves into this is the Senegalese director Mati Diop's film, Dahomey. This piece of docufiction documents how 26 objects were returned from a museum in France to their homeland in Benin, West Africa, back in 2022. These included thrones and statues of gods and kings that were looted by France in the 19th century. The fiction part of the film is that it gives voice to one of these statues, King Gezo. He wonders throughout the film, as a ghostly, disembodied voice, what he's returning to and what he will find back in West Africa, almost a whole century after being taken away. It reminds us that colonialism didn't just loot objects, it actually altered the context and the functions of these objects. It killed the context in which these objects may have been worshipped, used, or transfigured in daily life. So repatriation doesn't begin to address some of these more metaphysical losses, the losses that we cannot put a figure on and we cannot pay to make them go away. There are also questions often raised by the economic and political means by which objects, when they do return, are actually brought back to their native homelands. Let's stick to the example of the objects that were taken, then returned to Benin in Mati Diop's film. In the film, we learn that the then president of Benin, Patrice Talon, actually accepted a $22 million loan from France in order to build a museum guarded by security forces in order to be able to house these returning objects. Now, the conditions of this return, knowing that, raises some uncomfortable questions. Given that France was the former colonial power in Benin, as in much of West Africa, we can ask whether that loan was really necessary. Is it, in fact, another form of the continuation of dependency? These are just two examples of why repatriation, returning objects, is not enough. The final point I want to make, delving into a little bit of history, is that it also doesn't address the power structures and inequalities that actually birthed the idea of the museum in the first place. From the 19th to the 20th century, objects from colonized cultures were often classified as primitive, even as they were displayed as curiosities or trophies back in Europe. Museums also exhibited people, human beings, in so-called colonial villages. These pseudoscientific discussions were really concerned with somehow finding biological evidence that would justify colonial conquest. So there were often museums that would display human skulls or other kinds of remains in order to somehow pseudoscientifically prove that there were natural hierarchies between the races and genders. No such findings are scientifically validated today, but the museum still became a space where the public, especially in the 19th century, was being educated to believe that colonialism was almost a natural occurrence or even a biological inevitability. This kind of elevated position that museums claim for themselves, really troublingly reminiscent of the worldview that these very early spaces of display used to try and teach people. So real change would mean rethinking how museums are structured, genuinely reimagining them out of these strange and dark beginnings. For museums in the global north, this kind of reimagining might require letting go of the idea that they are the guardians of world culture, instead becoming equal collaborators in its restitution. And this can only happen not just through returning objects with massive loans stuck to them, but through genuine dialogue, accountability, and imagination. Thank you so much for watching The Global Gaze. If you have an opinion on this topic, drop us a comment below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so that you can see any of my new videos show up directly on your feed. Thank you so much for listening, and keep your gaze global.